everyone. Woo. Welcome. This is really amazing. I'm a little overwhelmed, as I've told some of you. I'll do my best to hold it together. So I, first of all, want to start off thanking everyone who's here, and specifically Ron, who did most of the work to make the physical stuff happen here, and also to Dick Simon. The three of us are a tripod who've kind of made this all happen. Dick has been really helpful in getting speakers and lots of behind-the-scenes thing. So I think most of you know, but the BPRG started in, oh, and thanks to my husband, Shippen, who's been so supportive through all this. And to and to Georgie. Ron and Georgie have been hosting us until now, and we're really grateful for their hospitality and very sad not to be there. And we're really glad to be here. Thanks to Daniel Lowe, who I don't see, but Daniel got us the space. He's a graduate student here. We're really grateful to you for that. And we feel really lucky that we're so big that we need this space. And we'll see how this all works. So I think most of you know that this started in my backyard, our backyard, in July 2018 with 12 people. And here we are now with an invite list of over 200, and I haven't counted, but about 150 people here today. Pretty amazing. People ask how it has been growing, and I say, like mycelium. And in this crowd, you know what I mean. So what we like to do is start off with some updates of what's happening, mostly in the Boston area, but it's not just the Boston area, in this field, so that those of you who haven't been with us before know what's going on and the right people to talk to and connect to if you have questions and want to get more involved. So I'd like to start just with a really brief update on the BPRG, the Boston Psychedelic Research Group. So we met yesterday, a group of us, 15 of us, to brainstorm about what next. What I like to say, I've said this to a lot of you, is that I've been the midwife and I birthed this. We're now a teenager, and I don't want the teenager alone. So please help. And so I just want to tell you some of the ideas that we batted around yesterday. We really made great progress, and anyone who was there who wants to add, please feel free. So we came up with a mission statement, which I hope isn't too corporate, but I think it is important to really think about what are we all about? And this is it. A community committed to education, promotion, and advancement of psychedelic research. So I think we can all remember that, can't we? Education, promotion, and advancement, that's what we're all doing here. So, and then we spoke about what sort of next steps, what we need to do, and there were three main things. One is we need administrative support to be pulling this all off, and we will definitely get that going. Sherry, who some of you may have met, she's way up high, but Sherry is going to be an amazing assistant for us. She was there greeting people, so I hope most of you have met her. If not, meet her, she's amazing. She's going to be helping behind the scenes, or maybe more in front, who knows, we'll see. And along with that, Sherry wants to help us build a website, which I think is going to be a really important piece of this that will support the administration. And then the second thing is funding. We're now big enough that, as you know, I asked you all to contribute, if that felt right to you, to this event today. And so we need to talk creatively about how we're going to do funding. We don't have any definite thoughts at this point. We have lots of thoughts, but we haven't honed it down to how we think is going to be best. So there's a group looking at that. And then there's a group that is looking at governance. And we already, thanks to my legal husband, have formed a nonprofit corporation, and we have a 501c3 under the umbrella of MAPS. Anyone who wants to make a donation, it can be tax deductible. And we have a bank account at the Cambridge Trust Company. So that makes us feel quite legitimate. The other thing that we've talked about before that I think is really important is how can we use the energy of all of you, you amazing people, and what would you like to do to help further this cause? And one of the thoughts that we put out, and we've been doing this, is affinity groups. So finding people, if there's a topic you're particularly interested in, try and find some other people who also want to work on that. So what we've done as an example is there was a group of us about, I don't know, a year and a half ago, pretty much close to when we started, that said we really want to get more ketamine-assisted psychotherapy going. And Libby's going to give us an update of what that group's done. It's been pretty amazing what they've done. And that happened by getting together on the side from this group. So some other ideas, and I'm just tossing ideas out to get you all thinking. If any of you are interested either in leading and starting an affinity group or want to be part of an affinity group, please email me and I'll try and make connections with people. So this was just some brainstorming. One that we already also have done is how are we going to help other cities do this? We have Chris Baer from DC, who we've helped start the DC Psychedelic Research Group, and we all would love to get this going in as many cities or many communities, they don't have to be cities. So anyone who has connections in other cities who would like to help with that, let us know. Political and education outreach, doing larger public events, such as, and now I can give you a plug, the Fantastic Fungi movie that's going to be on Tuesday night at the Regent Theater in Arlington. If people don't know about it, you can ask pretty much anyone here, but you can also go on the website, Fantastic Fungi, and you can get tickets for that. Investment or philanthropic opportunities people might want to know about. Media, including documentaries. I know we have a handful of documentary filmmakers here. Therapist certification, which I'm going to ask Jeremy to talk about. That's another group. Therapist training. Do we want a group that's going to talk about that? The opioid crisis or addiction in general. Is that something we can work on? Research updates, which we're already doing here, but we may want to have a group as the research gets to be so huge and so diverse in lots of different places. We may want a group that tracks the research and then comes back and reports to us. The website development will get started, but if there's anyone who wants to help us with that. The bi-monthly event logistics, which is really the administrative part that I think we're working on, but again, anyone who wants to help. And I think that's it for any other affinity groups I didn't mention that anyone wants to bring up? Great. Good. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to do is invite some people to come up to give us updates on projects that are going on. Just brief updates, but then that will help all of us get to know the players in the different areas. So the first one is the MAPS phase 3 study. And I'm lucky enough to be one of the therapists here, and my partner, colleague, Francis Guerrero, is going to give us an update. Thank you, Francis.
Hello, folks. It's nice to take this in. I was just at Ann's yesterday for the meeting. And that's the place that our MDMA team first started doing some team building work at Ann's house about 3 years ago. And yeah, it's pretty amazing to see what's become since then in a very, very short amount of time. So the quick updates, well, first of all, if you don't know, there's MDMA-assisted psychotherapy phase 3 clinical trials happening here in Boston, one of several sites around the nation. And we are doing this in 2 stages, MAP 1 and MAP 2, to achieve a certain participant count. What I'd like to do first is just introduce the therapists who are on the team. If you're willing to stand up, Libby Call, Jim Hopper, Mike Alpert, Susan Walker, Anne, and myself. So these lovely smiling creatures, if you're interested, want to know more about the study, more nitty-gritty, then find one of us and ask lots of questions. I can't say too much about the study. It is super top secret, double blind. But what I can say is that we are doing well. We are hitting our numbers. And so far as we can tell on this side of the double blind, having really, really effective psychotherapy happening. And to my eyes, having treated severe trauma and several other non-drug assisted contexts, we are doing breakthrough work. That's absolutely the fact. So we're excited and delighted to be a part of this and just gushing to talk about it anytime anybody's got questions. So find one of us and do so. We are in the process, we've just wrapping up the first leg of the 2 legs of the study, and we'll be screening more people. So also if you know people who have post-traumatic stress disorder and who might want to be involved in an experimental treatment, then find one of us also, and we'll connect you to who you need to talk to get them screened and possibly in the study. Okay. Oh, I was inspired. So the affinity group thing, I'm just going to announce that I'm going to be hosting an affinity group. The glorious thing about being in such a big space is that we're bringing more people in to network and connect. The downside of that is that we lose, and those of you who've been at Ron and Georgie's, we lose a community feel and fade a bit more into a collective. Collectives are great, groups are great, they are not community. So how do we sustain anything like cohesion among a community that's this large? Any of you who are clinicians and have done group work know it's not possible. So what I'm proposing is a psychedelic salon where we gather in smaller groups, like cell groups, once a month, 10 to 15 people. And that way, people have more intimate space to have dialogue and express and learn together. And then over the course of a year, everybody will have connected with everybody else in deeper ways than this facilitates. So I'm going to be hosting those at my place here in Cambridge, not far from here. If you're interested, come and see me about that. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Francis, and for volunteering to host. That's great. 2 other things I would like to mention. One is just last week, the FDA approved expanded access for the MDMA work. That means it's like compassionate care. Unfortunately, it's only for 50 people across the country, or the world. No, the country, I guess, because Israel is taking many more. But that's a really huge step that the FDA says not only are we effective enough or safe enough to offer to people within our protocol, but not within the study. So that's exciting. The other question I would like to ask and take advantage of this group is, as we're finishing up with participants in our study, not all of them have therapists who know about this work. So if any of you are therapists who have openings in your practices, are comfortable with severe trauma, and know about this work, please let me know. We really need to find a good cohort of therapists. And Mike, you want to say something?
Quick note with that, something that would be very helpful is if any of you are therapists who take insurance, we're really trying to find people who accept insurance, since many of our patients either have public insurance or don't have out-of-network benefits. Thank you.
Thanks. Important. Great. Any more maps, updates, or info? So now we're going to move on to the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy that's going on here in the Boston area, and Libby Call is going to tell us about that. Thank you.
Hi. Let's see. Some of you have already heard me talk about the origins of the ketamine work that I've been doing, but I wanted to repeat it for those who who weren't here last time and are new. About a year and a half ago, I was talking to my supervisor on the MDMA study, and I asked her, so, you know, is ketamine really kind of the inferior, you know, legal way to go until MDMA is actually approved? And she said, no, not at all, that it had its own place and its own value as a way to assist psychotherapy. And so that really encouraged me to take the training with Phil Wolfson in New York City a year and a half ago, and then to start doing it with I started with clients in my own practice. I'm an in-private practice in Cambridge, psychologist. And so I started with that group and had really wonderful experiences. And so kind of resolved to increase the number of people in the area that were also doing the work, because it is legal and it is a safe medicine. It is something that you can do in your offices that does not have the same kind of impact on the body that MDMA has. You can schedule it for 3-hour sessions. You do not have to be off SSRIs, so it has a lot of benefits in its use somewhere in the process of psychotherapy. So we invited Phil Wolfson to come and to do a training in October, and we did that. I would love, if you feel comfortable, all those who are at that training to stand up, whether you're doing it or not yet in your practices, but I just want people to get a sense of who is there. Great, thank you. So we have a growing number of people in the New England area who are doing this work using ketamine, and then as the data comes in and gets unblinded from this MDMA study and the psilocybin work and some of the other psychedelic medicines, hopefully we'll be in a position where people will have some experience and we can kind of just ease into offering this to our clients. So that's where we are. We have this new cohort of people trained. We're all kind of starting to do different practices around the area and to offer it, and stay tuned. We'll be continuing to do that. We also, Dick, we talked earlier today, this is the value of this group about, could we possibly do another one in the area? And I said, you know, I need to talk to Katie right there. And so I did, and she said, yeah, I think we have all the stuff. We could do that. So that's how this group works, which I love about it. It's really wonderful. So we went from, I'm not doing that again for a long time, to, yeah, maybe we could do that. So let's talk, Dick. And Katie and I are on it. Next year.
Thank you, Libby. Yvonne, and I'll let you describe what you're doing. Yvonne is a palliative care fellow at Dana-Farber and is particularly interested in psychedelics and has organized a symposium that's starting tonight at the Radcliffe Institute that he's going to tell us about, and that's why we're lucky enough to have Robin here with us today. Thank you, Yvonne.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to show you 3 slides. To present this work that will be starting tonight, actually, for 2 days. It has a lot to do with the BPGR, the Boston Psychedelic Research Group. I think this couldn't happen without me having met Anne, Dick, and Ron, so thank you so much. And it's something that I had in mind even back there in France as a palliative care physician, already interested in doing some psychedelic research in patients with a serious illness. And so why that?
and reflecting on why this seminar is important, I wanted to give a sense of the big picture. So the seminar is hosted by the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard. And the title is Researching Psychedelic-Assisted Therapies in Patients with Serious Illness. And so, how does that work? So we will be talking about serious illness and psychedelics. And in fact, we're also talking about death and non-ordinary state of consciousness. And there are some very interesting similarities between those two realities in our lives, in our communities, in our society. And so the seminar is about the intersection between those two realities. And what is the interesting similarities that I found is that these are two very transformative experiences, very powerful transformative experiences that can be both positively transformative or negatively transformative. And the quality of the experience is also very much depending on the set and setting. The experience of end of life and death or serious illness is not the same if I'm going to this or my family member is coming to this prepared with some kind of support and container. And it's the same with psychedelics, the psychedelic experience. And it also has a very strong component that is that has to do with existential issues and transcendence. It's something that connects us to something beyond what we experience immediately in our lives. And the last similarity that I found is that it has something to do about some kind of taboo and ineffability. It's hard to talk about it, it's hard to think about it, and it's kind of one of the big taboos of our cultures. And so our culture, our society, this is also very similar, has denied a lot death and psychedelics, or non-ordinary state of consciousness, and we think about death and dying and serious illness in terms of failure, something very morbid, something without a value, or fighting serious illness or fighting death is valued in our society. It's pretty much the same for psychedelics. We have considered it's recreational, underground, it's associated with marginal and abuse. And it's Schedule 1, and what is valued, so it has no value. Schedule 1 means no medical value, and there is a war on drugs. So what is valued is to fight psychedelics and non-ordinary state of consciousness. So I'm not saying that this is wrong, but I think this comes from fears that are around death and psychedelics. And those fears might be funded, and we might have good reason to be fear. But we are in a state where this denial is detrimental and has a very strong cost for us as individuals, communities, and societies, because we lose the opportunities that are associated with these experiences. And those opportunities are opportunities for growth and healing, opportunities for meaningful rituals, opportunities for knowledge, gaining some knowledge of oneself, thyself, life, connections, relationship, and some sense of sacredness. So how can we get back this potential, I think, is what's driving this seminar and this discussion that we have here, that we'll have on the Fantastic Hanggai screening. And I see two important concepts. So yeah, this is the denial. We lose this and we keep the failure and the war on drug. But I think two important concepts is integration and responsibility. And this is the way we can get back those potentials by integrating palliative care, support of seriously ill patients, and integrating the reality of death into our lives, and same for psychedelics. So this is kind of what we're going to talk during those 2 days. How we're going to do that is that thanks to the Radcliffe Institute, we are bringing experts, amazing people with amazing experience in research and in clinical practice from oncology, palliative care, psychiatry and psychology, spiritual care, and psychedelic-assisted therapy. And we have them consider and exploring the question, how might we move forward psychedelic research in patients with serious illness responsibly? So that's what it's about. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. It's exciting. And thanks to those of you who have come into town for Radcliffe to be with us. We love sharing this with you. One more update. I'm going to ask Marcina Hale, who's one of the executive producers of Fantastic Fungi. I forgot something. Thank you, Marcina.
Thanks, Anne. It's so funny because I'm introduced that way, but I'm actually a therapist. I keep telling people I'm actually trained with CIIS, but I've been working with the movie. And Yvonne, thank you very much for that presentation. And it sort of ties right into the movie. One of the reasons why I got involved with this movie was that when we saw it, it literally gave us an ability to be able to have conversations that we have not had before. And this movie it actually has over 2,000 requests, 52 different countries. It's been absolutely phenomenal, the results that's going on. And it's really about the swelling of the longing that's out there with people. And so it's a platform that I really encourage everyone in this room to use to get your voices out. If you're doing this work, there's the ability to do Q&As afterward, and we've been doing them with Tony Bassi's in New York, and we've been doing it with Mary Casimano, and we've had a beautiful response from all different pillars. So if you go to fantasticfungi.com and you look under ACT, you'll see 7 different pillars that we're working with. But in March 26th, we're going to be screening this film internationally and with over 500 theaters. And so we're encouraging everybody, no matter where you're living, to get your theater involved and actually set up a screening afterward. It's like what Yvonne, we're doing at on the 28th here. This is a way for people to understand, when you're looking at the fear, the ability to see this in a context that's non-threatening has been very powerful for people and been able to open it up. And so Louis Schwartzberg, if you guys don't know him, is the director and producer of the film. And Dick Simon, who's here, has been a big part of really helping get the film out as well. If you have any questions, we'll be around, and we hope to see you on the 28th. Thanks.
So next update, and these are also exciting. We're taking longer than we thought. I apologize, but I think it's really wonderful to be sharing this. Next update is from the Mass General group. So Charmin and Dick, you want to come on up?
Great, thanks so much. Before Mass General, I just wanted to make one comment building on the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy and other initiatives that have started from affinity groups here, to just re-emphasize Anne's suggestion that affinity groups or getting together with other people who care about whatever it is you care about make a huge difference and are a great way to engage with the community. I mean, I'm personally involved in the group that is looking at how we scale this, how we help support other groups like this that are forming elsewhere in the country, or how we help to catalyze that. So whatever area of affinity group you might be interested in, I cannot emphasize enough that it's incredibly satisfying to get involved and potentially incredibly impactful. Right. So an idea that we've come up with is that before the next meeting and before each of the meetings, we're going to have an hour and a half set aside. So it'll be the regular meeting, but an hour and a half before that for people who are interested in one of the affinity groups, so the affinity groups can just meet. It's the whole ketamine-assisted psychotherapy came about because a few people said, gee, we just had this great experience, and then started having a few meetings. The next thing you knew, there were 28 trained therapists, and now within the next year or so, there will be another training here in Boston. So whatever you're passionate about, get involved, and a huge return on investment for yourself as well as the world and the community. So Sharman and I are involved in Mass General Hospital's new psychedelic research initiative. And it's under the leadership of Jerry Rosenbaum, who's been running Mass General Hospital's psychiatry for the past 19 years. So what's really unique, in addition to all the gifts and attributes of being Harvard affiliated and being Mass General Hospital, which is generally ranked as the top psychiatric facility in the country, is that the leader of the institution is also going to be the leader of the psychedelic research initiative. So there's incredible potential there. And I'll mention just a couple of the studies that are very early in terms of there's interest, and in one situation it's in IRB, but huge potential. Originally, this was all being set up, and Franklin was a major catalyst in getting all this going, around strictly looking at the science and mechanism of action, looking at the brain, looking at the chemistry, all of which is definitely moving forward. In addition, there are some things, there are some trials or some studies that are being looked at therapeutically. How does this actually work? What happens, for example, to patients who are dealing with rumination issues, which is underlying a lot of other psychiatric illnesses? What about loneliness and PTSD? And how, in collaboration with MAPS, how might that, a study with MDMA look? And also, we were talking about ketamine earlier. Does ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, work? I mean, it sounds great, and massive anecdotal stories, and it's clear to everyone involved in the field, but how do you generate real data? And if so, what actual mechanisms of psychotherapy are most effective? So that's a little bit. At a later session, we're actually going to have a whole meeting, or a good part of a meeting, around what MGH is doing. But Sherman, if you would like to add something.
So our first study is,
I'm
sure.
sorry.
So I'm a psychiatrist at Mass General, and I'm also a neuroscientist. And my name is Sharman Ghaznavi, as Dick said. So we, Jerry and I both came to the field of psychedelic medicine sort of in a roundabout way. We're both really interested in rumination because we find that it's a transdiagnostic phenomenon that really affects nearly every one of our patients. And we learned about the potential for psychedelics to help our patients who are ruminating, because there's a lot of talk about a dissolution of ego and self getting out of the way. And so we decided to embark on a study to look at mechanism and also to see whether or not psilocybin could be helpful for rumination and treatment-resistant depression. And the main outcome for us is to really look at the mechanism and understand what happens with brain networks. And our larger initiative is to sort of understand what happens with brain networks that make for an environment that allows change to really take place, and increases the capacity for change.
Great. Thank you all very much.
One more. Jeremy, do you want to give an update?
Hey everyone, so my name's Jeremy, and I'm not a researcher or scientist. I'm an entrepreneur who is an ally of this work, and was fortunate enough to have attended most of the BPRG meetings and finally found something I could do and contribute back. And that is to help bring into the world a professional association that supports the practitioners of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So my role, such as it is right now, is really a facilitator, and I like the term midwife, of gathering together multiple stakeholders across the country to help shape what a professional association should be. Some of that is obviously going to be impacted, or a lot of that is going to be impacted by what the federal government says that should be. So right now we're in the process of coming up with a bit of a mission statement. And really it's around advocating on behalf of all of you guys that are going to be doing this amazing work to ensure that you're adequately protected, that you're adequately compensated by insurance companies, and that the work that everyone is collectively doing is understood at the various regulatory bodies that will actually be involved in setting these rules. So very early stages, but I just wanted to, for those that haven't been aware of it, I wanted to let you know that it is a group that is meeting regularly. We do have some language that's shaping up, but we're also, and I stress this a lot, we're very much following the work that's going on with MAPS and the FDA, and not trying to sort of get ahead of our skis and make statements that may ultimately, not be valuable. So that's what's going on. If you guys have any questions about that, feel free to find me after the rest of the meeting. Thanks.
And we're lucky enough today to have an out-of-town luminary because of the Radcliffe Gathering. So Manish Agrawal is an oncologist in the DC area who's starting a center using these medicines, and he's going to give us just a little bit of a snippet, a tease, to tell us what he's doing, and we hope that we'll be able to get him back as he gets up and running to tell us more about what they're doing. Thank you, Manish.
Thanks, Anne. So I'm Manish Agrawal. I'm a medical oncologist and work at the Aquilino Cancer Center, which is right next to the NIH, a suburb of Washington, D.C. And we're building in permitting right now to start construction next month on a purpose-built space for psychedelic work. But it's actually more along what Yvonne was talking about. It's really a center where people with serious illness can come for transformation or for healing. And so it's 2,500 square feet of shell space, and it's inside the cancer center. And sort of what we've been telling our community is that, it's a beautiful cancer center. There's a great place to get radiation, to get chemotherapy, to get PET scans, but there's no place that you can go to sort of take care of your psychological well-being. And so this is a space that's going to be called the Bill Richards Center for Healing. And Bill is here. And so the first third is sort of a public space where you will have like meditation and yoga, and Robin will give a talk there one day. And the middle space for more group integration, and then the last space is 4 rooms for psychedelic therapy. And then we're initiating a trial that should open in probably April or May with cancer patients with depression and anxiety. It's past the IRB, and it's through the FDA, but I don't have the letter in my hand yet, but it should be open in 2 or 3 months. And so more to come when we're up and running. The other thing is actually we're going to be, as we're speaking to oncologists in the oncology community, we'll be providing more resources for that community. And so stay tuned as we want to support sort of this bringing to oncology patients.
So much going on. It's really great. Thank you, everyone who presented, and keep the thoughts coming. So, Dick, do you want to introduce Robin, or shall I go ahead? Okay. I think Robin doesn't really need an introduction. I know that's really trite, but I think a lot of you are here because Robin's here. So we're really grateful to have Robin Carhart-Harris from Imperial College here with us today, neuroscientist. He's well known that I pulled out the pictures today that are in Michael Pollan's book about the connections that are made in the brain that you're going to teach us about. And the other quote from Robin that I use all the time when I'm trying to talk about this work is the snow globe quote, which probably most of you know about, but that we ski in ruts that are frozen, and these medicines help create a snow globe in our brain, and then we settle and we have fluffy snow to go through instead of the ruts. Along those lines, and I haven't told Robin this, Mike and I, with our participant in the MDMA study 2 weeks ago, after her 3rd session, she said, I feel like I was just in a snow globe. and stop. We said, you must have read Michael Pollan's book, you must know Robin Carhart-Harris's work, and she looked at us blankly. So you communicated with her somehow.
Yeah, came from the aliens.
That's right. So anyways, so Dr. Snow Globe, it's great to have you.
Okay. Well, maybe the theme of the day is feeling lucky, because I certainly feel very lucky whenever I come over here, and just feel the community that surrounds this area. I feel the warmth, the welcome, and this sense of gratitude, and it's really special, and it's just so special to be a part of it. And there's a typo on my first slide, because it says, let's see if it comes up, it says the Center for Psychedelic Research, and it should just say a center, of course, because we are part of a wonderful network of growing centers now supporting this research, and here we are at Harvard. How special and how lucky we are to be here. Now, what I want to do with this talk is walk you through a kind of multi-level talk and do things relatively broad brush. I won't really drill down into the details. I want to more provide some thinking, some food for thought, maybe inspire a few ideas. But I will do it in a multi-level way. So I'll talk about molecular and then kind of circuit level, neurophysiology, and up to whole brain effects as well. But when I do that, I want to also frame it and provide a context for it. So let's start really at the molecular. You don't need to be given a definition of classic psychedelics. We know the etymology, soul revealing, soul manifesting, and we know these tryptamine psychedelics and how molecularly they share similarities with 5-hydroxytryptamine, such an important neuromodulator and complex neuromodulator in our bodies and in our brains. And we also know that these compounds work on the serotonin system, but we know with increasing confidence and really increasing finesse, the aspect of the serotonin system that's so critical to their action, and it's the serotonin 2A receptor. And we know where that's expressed increasingly well with developing advancements in positron emission tomography particularly. So here we can look at an image and see that, as we knew for a long time, it's very much a cortical receptor, not much in subcortical regions. And the distribution cortically isn't entirely homogeneous. There are certain regions that have more expression than others. And what we can say about that, which is consistent with the fact that most of the 2A receptor is in the cortex, that aspect of brain that we as human species have so much of. But we also know, again, sticking with that hierarchical theme, that it's particularly high-level cortex, association cortex, that you see those receptors most densely expressed. We know since the mid-80s that the affinity of a psychedelic drug for the 2A receptor, acting as an agonist, stimulating that receptor, correlates very strongly with the potency of that compound. LSD, very high affinity, stimulates that receptor, and you only need a very tiny amount. You compare that to mescaline, much lower affinity, still an agonist, but much lower affinity. And rather than 20 mics or less being active with LSD, you need about 0.5 gram of mescaline to have a big experience. We also know that if you block, increasingly well we know this from a number of different studies, that if you block in animals and human animals, that if you pre-treat with a serotonin 2A receptor antagonist or blocker, effectively you'll abolish the signature subjective and behavioral effects of the psychedelic that you subsequently give. So really compelling evidence for the importance of this particular receptor. And now we also have this nice PET work, which is looking at the proportion of available serotonin 2A receptors that are occupied by psilocybin in this case, different doses, and how that relates to the subjective effects. Now, there's something about this chart that I was reflecting on hearing Yvonne speak and thinking about potential nonlinearities in the serotonin system and in the serotonin 2A receptor system especially. And you can see some hints at that in these data, that beyond a certain occupancy range, round about half of the receptors, once you get above that, there's a kind of inflection point, and things get really interesting. And rather than these sort of low-dose perceptual effects that you might see with lower doses of psychedelics, or even the microdose ranges, all of a sudden you've got something entirely other. And I think, and this will lead on to my next slide, this might be a hint at an all-important question that perhaps we've somewhat overlooked, which is why can we trip? Why do those receptors exist? What are they for? Evolutionarily, functionally, what are they for? And so really this slide is about starting to think about that. We know of this relationship, first of all, between serotonin itself and plasticity, broadly defined, whether that be neuroplasticity or other aspects of plasticity like cognitive, psychological flexibility. But we also know of this specific relationship between the 2A receptor and plasticity. We can look at neuroplasticity and markers of it in the brain and see, especially in the cortex, again, something that sometimes is overlooked, that it's a cortical phenomenon. You see increases quite reliably in markers of neuroplasticity with exposure to 2A agonists, psychedelics. We also know of the involvement of serotonin and the 2A system in brain development and in learning and unlearning or extinction learning. And I've already mentioned psychological flexibility. You can think of certain psychotherapy models like acceptance and commitment therapy that rest on this notion of psychological flexibility, and also cognitive flexibility, which is really more about set shifting, changing behaviors that can become rigid, constrained, and sort of habitual. So, we can look at learning rate with a psychedelic LSD and how that can be sped up with exposure to LSD, and how it can be slowed down with a 2A blocker. So the importance of that 2A receptor for essentially accelerating learning rate, whether that be learning or unlearning, plasticity, and the paradox of plasticity in that neuroplasticity in and of itself isn't intrinsically a good thing. It just means you have a supple brain that can either take things in more easily, new things, or perhaps things that have become entrenched can be weakened and unlearned. And so that's, again, a hint from the mechanisms to the therapeutic model that given that sort of foundation of plasticity, you want to do good with it. In and of itself, it's not intrinsically healing, but it's just an opportunity. It's a vehicle for change, and then you need to seize the day with that change. And so really that's where I'm going with this slide, which is trying again to address that question of what the 2A receptor is for. There's a wealth of evidence to show an association between stress and an upregulation of the serotonin 2A receptor. And as I've said, this strong association between 2A receptor signaling and plasticity and the things, the functional behavioral things that come with plasticity. And so it's not a unique hypothesis. It's been brought up by Kevin Murnane recently, essentially suggesting that the 2A receptor is there for accelerating, you could say accelerating learning rate. Remember, I was talking about that nonlinearity in the serotonin system. Sure, there can be a sort of gradual, somewhat continuous increase in learning rate, but what about that inflection point at which you can potentially have transformation, psychological transformation? And so this is a notion that I'm working on introducing at the moment, these pivotal mental states. It's really saying that through this system that exists, not for psychedelics would be my suggestion, it exists because it's evolved really for adaptability during conditions of existential distress, times of crisis in which we need to be especially supple because literally our lives may depend on it. And so in these pivotal mental states, you have massively heightened plasticity if you're hitting that 2A receptor hard. And so it's so important that the context, if you're doing this intentionally, that the context be right so that the experience can be guided in a positive direction. Because if this was to happen without that positive contextual manipulation, let's say you experience a trauma and are in a heightened state of plasticity, or through distress and such like, you're moving towards a psychosis, and the conditions are bad, and things can take the wrong turn. And you can look at what happens after the event and start to characterize that disorder now as something that has a particular neurobiology, and overlook the fact that it occurred through a process. And perhaps part of the picture has been missed when you take Dr. Hindsight's perspective and just look at the outcome rather than the process that led up to it. And so that's a kind of ideas aspect stemming from the molecular level. But now I'm moving into an overview of the application of psychedelics. It's important and necessary, I think, to say something about the safety profile. So let's just run through it, that these compounds don't appear to have any appreciable addiction potential. Animals don't self-administer them. If anything, they seem to be fundamentally aversive. And the toxicity profile seems to be very good, particularly with a compound like psilocybin. Very remarkably large therapeutic index, the doses that are given therapeutically relative to what we might need to give in terms of a huge dose to see any kind of toxicity. That window is massive with a compound like psilocybin, not something that you could say about a lot of licensed medicines and legal drugs. So what are the risks? Because all drugs carry risks. All interventions carry risks. Well, we can look at the experience itself. Really, that's, I suppose, where most of the risk lies. And those who know psychedelic therapy, of course, know of the importance of set and setting and context and preparation and supervision and aftercare. But if that's not in place, and people aren't in a safe container, then risks around injurious behavior, dysphoria that isn't worked through in a skillful therapeutic way but is allowed to spin out of control. And then a question mark over iatrogenesis, so this is symptoms getting worse, because you hear of cases, you hear of anecdotes, you don't often see too many cases, and the population studies, as we know, suggest that psychedelic use is associated with anomalous improvements in mental health outcomes, anomalous because other drugs of potential misuse, typically you don't see that relationship. But even so, it's worth flagging. Sorry, I've got a timer on that tries to keep the flow so I don't get too stuck on slides. But sometimes it's a bit annoying. But it's also useful, I think. So, of course, the side effects, anxiety and subacute headaches. But as others will know, when someone has a relatively minor headache the next day after psychedelic therapy, but puts it in the context and says, I would take this headache over 20 years of crippling depression, they're going to take the headache. And this scale of harms that came from my long-term mentor, David Nutt, that has magic mushrooms there down at the bottom of this scale of harm. Blue is harms to users, red harms to others. So that was an assessment that David did with a team of different experts, and it's something that's been replicated by others as well, assessing the relative harms of different drugs of potential misuse. Now, in a sense, this could be, of course, its own talk covering the latest findings from the clinical research, and we all know that there's a lot of new data to come, new papers coming this year and next particularly. And so what are the take-homes? And really, you can look at a lot of these different studies and see a rapid action, whether it be a rapid drop in depression scores, as we saw in our treatment-resistant depression trial, and the enduring nature of the improvements. You know, again, an anomaly in psychiatry, biomedical psychiatry, that a drug which is out of the body in a few hours really, seems to be associated with these enduring improvements. Typically, a drug dosing regimen is daily and essentially you're chronically medicated. So this is a really challenging model for the biomedical model to wrap its head around. So rapid and enduring action, transdiagnostic potentially action. There's a lot of different indications here. As we know, things are going in a good direction in terms of philanthropic investment, commercial investment, and the regulators seem to be on side as well. Now, just a reflection of the importance of context. To my knowledge, all of these studies manipulated context in a particular way, attention to set and setting. I think all of them used music. Again, something that could easily be overlooked if you didn't know about the therapeutic model. So let's very much keep that in mind when we think about psychedelic therapy. So promising, and the nature of it has so many components of hybridity. Is that a word? I think so. That it's a drug, but also it's deeply psychological. That it's occupying a kind of middle space there where there's a synergy between pharmacology and psychology. It's old world, it's new world. There's lots of spaces of complex hybridity that you could see with this treatment model. And that's worth bearing in mind because, as we know, historically, psychiatry has been so divided. You're either in the biomedical camp or the psychological intervention camp. And isn't that a shame? And perhaps, the generation of those in and around mental health in the future are going to take more of a sort of middle way view of mental health. Speaking to context, to put a bit of meat on the bone rather than everyone banging on about set and setting, but not really providing much evidence to back up the, we've got to say, pretty solid assumption. We've taken the approach of collecting naturalistic data in order to tackle this tricky problem. Tricky because no one wants to provide adverse conditions when they give a big dose of a psychedelic. So is there another way? And this naturalistic way of collecting big data through a platform we have called psychedelicsurvey.com is one way we're doing that. All of these are predictors that passed the significance threshold after correction. So these are all important predictors of an important aspect of the acute experience that we and others know very well now is such a critical mediator of the therapeutic outcomes. This is a very broad population, so we looked at mental well-being, but the same you could imagine would apply to depression scores, whatever your main outcome measure is. Trait absorption, their childhood trauma, probably because there's work to do, so there's greater scope for change in the mental health outcome, all predicting emotional breakthrough, emotional catharsis that's associated with these positive therapeutic outcomes. Therapeutic intentions, rapport, emotional support. I've weighted the circle by the strength of the association. Emotional support is so critically important, and listening to music as well. Okay, so this is just to put a bit of a human touch on the theme, emotional breakthrough, what is it? We developed to scale the emotional breakthrough inventory that we're applying in our research increasingly, and it seems to be a very reliable predictor of therapeutic outcomes. Here's somebody saying, I was weeping, tears were flowing out of me, it wasn't a painful crying, it was like turning on the taps, like a washing out. This is from our treatment-resistant depression trial. Another patient saying, I saw negative patterns in my life where if something bad happens, I used to just put it to the back of my mind, emotional or experiential avoidance. Afterwards, I allowed myself to experience everything, even if it's sadness. Now I know how to deal with my feelings rather than repress them. So I hinted at this, and you've heard it already, this growing awareness of some transdiagnostic space, some critical target that psychedelics seem to come in and hit. I know, it's bad, but it's best I could come up with. I don't want to use videos because they go wrong, so you've got my NAF animation. And so the suggestion is, and you could certainly put negative rumination here, these patterns of cognition or behavior that we can fall into perhaps when we're uncertain, when we're in conditions of stress. And then we might just express our suffering in a particular way. We might fall into an addiction, whatever its flavor, if you want, whatever the flavor of the anxiety that becomes entrenched, whether it's phobic, existential, social. We can look at a bias in our thinking in depression, the classic negative cognitive bias, obsessive and compulsive symptoms, again, consistent with habits of mind and behavior, and eating and image disorders as well. So that's a suggestion that these are all examples where thinking and behavior have become kind of canalized. They've gone down a particular route, and then they get practiced, they become habitual, and they're very difficult to shake up. But we all know about the snow globe. And so there's our window of opportunity to relax those biases, those habits, and then use that window of opportunity to work on a revision of those unhealthy habits of mind and behavior. That's what I'm suggesting is a transdiagnostic model of sorts. And I guess the key question for the future is to define that better, to define it both psychologically, ideally behaviorally, and neurobiologically as well. So that's a challenge. So now shifting again our attention onto another theme, the acute action of psychedelics. You heard about our circles. So this is the brain after placebo, what we would imagine you would see in the brain during baseline conditions, that regions within a system, the color being a system or a network, typically talk to each other more than they talk to other systems. So there's a kind of cliquish communication structure going on. These are kind of Markov blankets. They're sort of silos that are siloed off from each other, whether it be the visual system or an auditory system. Most of the communication goes on ordinarily within the system. But then throw in a psychedelic and you get this interesting global interconnectivity of communication. It's important to emphasize these aren't anatomical connections. This is functional connectivity. So this is communication strength between different regions of the brain as we look at the spontaneous brain activity. We saw the same thing with LSD that we saw with psilocybin here, running the analysis in a slightly different way, taking the V1 aspect of the visual cortex associated with processing quite rudimentary aspects of the visual sensorium, and then asking the question, where ordinarily does in the brain is activity correlated, synchronous with the target V1 region? And usually it's constrained to the visual system, the part of the visual system talking to the rest of the visual system. Under LSD, it's most of the brain. And so this correlated with complex visual imagery under LSD, and it's easy to speculate that it's associated with how the visual experience is especially vivified, complex, sort of transmodular in a way, in the sense that different modalities, like the auditory modality, can start to kind of contaminate and influence what's happening in the visual modality. We also know about this acute disintegration of the default mode network. Here with LSD, we looked at a particular circuit within the default mode network, parahippocampal to retrosplenial cortex, and we saw this strong relationship with a breakdown in the strength of the coupling in the activity between those two regions, and ratings of ego dissolution. So something to back up that assumption that we know in cognitive neuroscience that this particular network, the default mode network, is associated with particularly high-level, arguably species-specific functions like imagination, counterfactual thinking, or being able to think of things that aren't immediately apparent there and then, self-consciousness, self-reflection. And so this particular network, its breakdown under the drug is associated with ego dissolution, makes sense in that context. We also know that a particular oscillatory rhythm that dominates the rhythmicity of brain activity ordinarily, particularly in our species, particularly in humans, this rhythm is so prominent, and actually increasingly so as we mature. It's less prominent when we're infants, but it's something that really kicks in as we develop. It's associated with a default mode network, positive relationship there, and so it kind of makes sense that under psychedelics you see a collapse in it. And the magnitude of the collapse in the alpha oscillation also correlates with ratings of ego dissolution. So these are kind of candidate substrates, dynamic substrates for the ego or our sense of self. The entropic brain is something I introduced in 2014 and then kind of updated it a couple of years ago. It's quite a simple principle that goes like this. It says that the complexity or the richness of ongoing brain activity is related to the richness of conscious experience. So if brain activity is simple, if it's not complex, let's say you fall into deep sleep or you're under a general anesthetic, your brain activity starts rolling in this slow and predictable way. What's the content of consciousness? Well, there's not much there, there's not much to it. If people come out of deep sleep, go into dream sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, all of a sudden the activity is complex again. It's rich. And what are the content of consciousness? Well, it's rich again. It's quite close in richness to what it is during normal waking consciousness. Until we threw psychedelics at this problem, it looked as though normal waking consciousness was the state of maximal entropy, if you want, or complexity of ongoing brain activity. And still, to my knowledge, I always say this, I haven't seen another state that is more complex than normal waking consciousness, except with psychedelics, mind-revealing compounds. Something that I was very aware of when doing this talk was that there's so much more that could be said. And it's kind of a shame I have to do the broad brush thing, because now we've got data coming up from studies where we've recorded brain activity during the psychedelic experience and found that this measure of brain entropy or complexity correlates with people's experiences of insight, and insight is correlating very strongly with the longer-term changes that we're seeing after the experience. Now, this schematic I made, I'd want to change these days because I don't think unconsciousness is accurate. Part of the thinking here was actually inspired by 5-methoxy-DMT, where people describe this whiteout. It's not a blackout when you're under an anesthetic and consciousness drops away and becomes contentless. Consciousness may become contentless, but it's still there, these non-dual states. And so part of the thinking was maybe, with 5-MeO, you move into this space, but to call it unconsciousness, I'm not sure. And this is very speculative. We haven't done that yet. We plan a 5-MeO study, but it's going to be a challenge to get it through ethics. It's something that we're doing in collaboration with Giulio Tononi, and so we're all very intrigued, how that's going to come out. And one of the comparators is DMT, which is content-rich. It's very visually vivid and rich, and so being able to compare those two compounds with this particular metric is especially intriguing. So that's the entropic brain. And this is the newer principle that I've introduced, which is inspired by hierarchical predictive coding. How we do? Yeah, and isn't it funny that with the first and the last letter in the right order, our ability to group, to take shortcuts, to allow our internal predictive models to really dominate our experience of the world, we're able to read a passage like that. And we see a movie like this as well, and it's funny when we realize that it's not actually a movie, and it's not moving at all. But for how many people in the audience is this moving for? Oh, good, that was very effective. But ordinarily in nature, you see something like this, there would be motion. So it calls up our internal predictive models, and that's what we hallucinate. As Anil Seth says, we hallucinate our experience of the world through our internal predictive models. And so the hypothesis with psychedelics, first of all, let's take the healthy brain. This whole scheme, this hierarchical predictive processing scheme that dominates now, I think it's fair to say, cognitive neuroscience and increasingly is becoming influential in psychiatry, rests on hierarchy in the system, that high levels of the hierarchy impose priors or predictions on lower levels. And ordinarily in a healthy brain, there's a relatively even balance between the weighting of the internal predictive models and how receptive we are to evidence that can come up and impinge on them and potentially change those models. There's a bit of a bias towards the predictive models, as we've just seen from those examples. And that probably helps us have a sense of assuredness as we navigate our way through the world, that things are kept steady, that these predictive internal models are dominating our experience of the world. In pathology, maybe that dominance is too weighty. Maybe those negative patterns of thinking, like in depression, I'm worthless, life is pointless, kind of paradoxically, we start to feel that with such confidence. No, I'm not interested in what you're saying, I am worthless, And those models become so dominant and so weighty and so difficult to shift. Even if there's evidence coming up, you don't hear it. Life is bad. And how does that manifest? Well, we've heard from so many different authors now of this disconnection, again, a kind of transdiagnostic theme in mental suffering, a potential common denominator, this sense of disconnection. Here's a patient from our TRD trial saying, I'd look at orchids and intellectually, cognitively understand that there was beauty, but not experience it. So the evidence wasn't getting up. The internal model was too weighty. And so it's simple, really, that with psychedelics, the prediction is that you de-weight. It's terrible, I know. The predictive models, so that the bottom-up information can get up. It can start to impinge on those higher-level models more easily. Now that they're less dominant, things like memories, emotion can be felt and heard. And with the right kind of supportive context, one can sit with that and work towards a healthy revision of those unhealthy predictive models. That's a model, the Rebus model. Bits of evidence from brain imaging, from psychological studies, behavioral studies, and also looking at the phenomenology back this up. I would say it's very much a work in progress, like all of these things. There's a lot of candidates coming on to the scene now in terms of things like traveling waves, gradients in the brain that we're looking at and seeing actually that they are consistent with the model. So it's a work in progress, really, to turn the theory into something that is really being tested and potentially supported by the data, it seems to be. And so what would be the ideal solution with the relaxation of these internal models, these priors, would be to have a renewed sense of connection, a reconnection, a realignment between what's inside in terms of our predictive models and what's coming up from the outside world, whether it's a sense of feeling more reconnected in one's body more embodied, connected more fully to other people, connected more fully to life, a sense of purpose and such like. Here a patient after the treatment in our trial saying a veil dropped from my eyes, things were suddenly clear, glowing bright. I looked at plants, I felt their beauty. I can still look at my orchids and experience that. So really that's a model of relaxing those internal models. So that's a model of the acute action of the drug. But critically, when we're thinking of the therapeutic work, we're interested in the lasting changes. So what about the revision of these internal models? The classic one in depression is that negative cognitive bias, that pessimistic bias that makes us think that there's nothing worth living for, that we're worthless and such like. At baseline, we ran a task that required people to predict what was going to happen in their lives over the next month. And it was a list of some negative stuff and some positive stuff, and they put a weighting on the likelihood of those things happening. So a negative thing like being arrested or losing a family member, positive things like having a out-of-town friend come and visit. So they put a weighting on, and lo and behold, at baseline, the depressed patients showed this very clear negative bias. Only bad things were going to happen in the next month. Post-treatment, there was a remediation of that negative cognitive bias. That was nice to demonstrate. Now, this is where we are. This is my last slide, penultimate slide. We're 2/3 of the way through, more actually. We've virtually recruited everyone, 60 patients, 30 v 30, double-blind RCT, 6 weeks of escitalopram, and 2 treatment sessions with a very low dose of psilocybin versus 225 milligrams, so quite a high dose of psilocybin, the dose that's being used in most of the current clinical trials. 3 weeks apart, these dosing sessions, balancing for having a dosing session and for receiving and being told that you're going to receive psilocybin. So that was inspiration from the Hopkins work in end-of-life care. But also 6 weeks of taking placebo capsules in this arm. We've had a little look, privileged look at the preliminary data. That's why I say get ready, because I'm almost frightened at what we're seeing, actually. So, yeah, and to thank Yvonne and Ron and Anne and Dick for this opportunity, to thank our wonderful special team, our Sangha among the broader Sangha community, and of course those who've made it possible to be inquirers, to not necessarily have a channel-focused agenda, but to be able to have that liberty and privilege to just ask questions. And it's our founders of our center that have really given us that privilege. And thank you very much for your attention. I know that I get to throw this at people who want to ask a question. It's not because I think negatively of you. It's the way it works. Or do you want to do that? Oh, okay. What a shame. Oh, okay, so it's working. Right. Do I kick it? Right, here we go. It's going to be robust to this? Within reason? Okay. Okay.
So you described that one of the mechanisms of the effectiveness in psilocybin and psychedelics in allowing neuroplasticity, making the brain more impressionable, more open to new experiences. Are you also suggesting that the same thing or something very similar happens during experiences of trauma? That it's the same receptors, there's a moment of plasticity, but in fact what is received and then somehow becomes concretized is the trauma rather than the positive, refreshed experience?
Yes, absolutely. That's it. And so I think it's useful to introduce this notion of a kind of fundamental state, pivotal mental state, pivotal because it's like a unstable attractor. If you think of dynamical systems and how systems can have a gravitational pull into a particular configuration that can become stable. In a pivotal mental state, it's incredibly unstable, the system, and so what happens in that context is so essentially important, because whether the context is positive or negative is going to determine where the system then resides and kind of crystallizes. So yes.
Hi, thanks for that really interesting talk. So I hope this comes out louder. I hope this comes out properly or coherently, but I thought it was really interesting to see the lack of expression in the 2AR receptor in the striatum and the hippocampus, especially with the high expression in the default mode network. And I think that adds a lot of weight to the theory you went through in terms of the priors and rebalancing the bottom-up versus the top-down inputs into patterns of cognition. So I wanted to know if you had a comment on, because at the same time, we know that PTSD and depression do have significant effects on the hippocampus. So I just was curious about your thoughts about the interrelationships of those systems and how, mechanistically, what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge given the tools that we have. Until you start to sort of delve into brain imaging, you sort of feel like you can almost do anything, or scientists can do anything, and then you realize that we're quite limited. And so we'd love to be able to record oscillatory activity from the deep emotional centers, the hippocampus and such like, but we can't, because we can't stick electrodes into those regions ordinarily to record that oscillatory activity. An fMRI can't do it because the signal doesn't have sufficient temporal resolution. So it's things like that that make it difficult to, that's a challenge in terms of the tools, but I'm very interested in a kind of, the interrelation between limbic activity and cortical activity under psychedelics, and sort of feel that there's likely, just through indirect evidences, I suppose, that that relationship's going to be critical to understanding the therapeutic mechanisms.
Hi. First of all, I'll stand up.
Yep.
I raised my hand as soon as I had an opportunity to ask a question, then my heart went right into my throat.
Well, I tried to reach you at the throat.
Yeah. But knowing I'm going to ask you a question, it definitely got me a little nervous. But basically, one of the things that I'm curious about as a therapist on both sides of the chair, and I think something you were getting into towards the end, was longevity. And I think without a doubt, like some of these substances we're talking about change the episode, the state, that there's a presence with the individual that's available that's really hard to get to without that. But in my own therapy, one of the things I've talked to my therapist about is a Freudian idea of the defenses, and that in the relationship with him, we work through our defenses because of that relationship, and allows us to arrive at a space that allows us a different longevity as far as wellness. So one thing I've been curious about, it feels like in some ways we can understand psychedelics as like a way around the defenses and allows us to a certain feeling and presence. But then the longevity of that, what do you think about that idea of kind of hopscotching the defenses rather than working through them and understanding what they mean?
Well, I'm really glad you've asked this question because, obviously I'm immersed in the field and I've agree with the general sentiment within the field, and increasingly without, that there's huge potential with psychedelic therapy, but what are the pitfalls and what are the hidden pitfalls? Bypassing, which is what you're describing essentially, hopscotching, might be one of the hidden pitfalls. Let's imagine you can get to 0 to 100 miles an hour with a compound like 5-MeO, and there's no struggle, there's no working through defenses, there's not even any talking, maybe afterwards, but you've bypassed a lot of the process, a lot of the work, and yet you're at ego dissolution. And so people can come back from that thinking that they have transcended in this permanent way, but perhaps some important psychological material has been bypassed in the process, and in time, maybe the system, the being, isn't so stable, and what's been bypassed catches up with you. So it's difficult because I also know that classic psychoanalytic psychotherapy hasn't worked as a cost-effective model. And so we do need something that can accelerate that process. But there's a purity and an integrity, I think, to that classic psychoanalytic model that we should take very seriously.
Sure, I guess I'll go next. My name is Rachel, and for the purposes of this question, I'll say that I was a participant in the major depression trial at Hopkins with psilocybin. And my question is inspired by the image you showed of the person in the boat heading towards this pivotal mind state, maybe an emotional breakthrough, maybe iatrogenesis, new word for me.
Iatrogenesis.
And my question, perhaps unfashionable, is inspired by the word responsibility, which Yvonne used. And I'm wondering, what responsibility does the psychedelic research community have to develop a more rigorous and sophisticated understanding of difficult experiences and counter-therapeutic experiences? I'm thinking of even, developing a typology of what that looks like, and perhaps best practices about how to respond. I personally have found the literature somewhat lacking in an understanding there, and I'm wondering what more could be done.
That's a very good point. All I could do is sort of agree and sort of endorse the point, really, but then it falls on people like me to do something about it. But obviously, more broadly, anyone researching psychedelics. But we have the challenging experience questionnaire that's been developed out of Hopkins, which is useful, and that has a few different factors within it. But I think what we need, with psychedelic survey, part of the thinking there is to collect big data than you can get in small, expensive, controlled research that can add an evidence base to that typology to say that if you have a challenging experience that doesn't resolve, for example, but just loops and you're stuck in it, then that's, particularly, sort of bad news and associated with worse outcomes. But then questions like, but then what? What's indicated after that? And all those finer nuances, I hope and anticipate that's for the future. But you're absolutely right that we should be thinking about that kind of thing now, including the brain imaging. Something I say to colleagues is, we've got no handle, and the question often comes up, particularly in public lectures, what are the neural correlates of a bad trip? How's that different to, this broad brush statement of this is the psychedelic state, which understandably I know people question. And the honest answer is that we don't know yet. I could speculate at it, but until we do something within the session, whether it's even just like a VAS scale that you push to one side if it's positive and the other if it's challenging, and sort of binarize the problem. Something like that might move us forwards, but it has to be said, our understanding of that is very rudimentary at this stage.
Sort of going off on the topic of bad trips, you had a slide that talked about the favorable safety profile of LSD and psilocybin. I was wondering if there are people for whom psychedelic therapy would be contraindicated, like, for example, people with a history or strong risk factors for psychotic illness, and if that risk is mediated at all by the set and setting or the quality of the therapist. I also noted that the rapport with the therapist on one of your slides was the significance of that in terms of the emotional experience that the participant had was a little less significant than the other factors, making me think that perhaps the therapy that's going on or the presence of the therapist is a little bit less influential in that experience, but I was wondering if that has anything to do with the risk of negative effects?
Yeah, there's a strong assumption, and mostly it's an assumption that anyone at risk because of a personal history of psychotic episodes or family history or a personal history of any bipolarity as well, that psychedelic therapy be contraindicated in that population. And it is an assumption because we can only go by cases where maybe prolonged psychotic disorders appear to have been precipitated by a psychedelic experience. I can see conceptually how that could happen, where if we take the pivotal mental state idea, in the developing psychosis, you would imagine you have a particularly unpleasant, negative set and setting. You know, someone is experiencing all this anxious uncertainty and distress, and it's not going to take much to tip them over into something where they think, it's all about the feds are watching me, or it's the aliens, you know. Yes, but it should be said it's kind of assumption. Personality disorders is an interesting one because it often comes up. What are the potential there? And I think there are times when we have to say we don't know, and we don't know what we don't know. So what do we do in those situations where we can only really come up with sort of theory and conjecture? And so I could imagine in personality disorders, maybe it's just that the model needs to change. Maybe a one-shot approach that can shift a kind of reactive depression into wellness and that's sustained isn't going to work with a complex personality disorder. And it's just a matter of adapting the model for certain populations, maybe with more sessions, maybe even with other substances, maybe, you know, different doses. And yeah, hopefully I've answered enough your question because there was a few different bits. So.
I think you've given us a lot to think about, a lot of food for thought. I'm Ira Byak. I'm a palliative care physician. I'm trying to integrate a number of the things that you said and the metaphors and models that you've used with the data. For many years, I've assumed that one had to achieve a level of ego dissolution or mystical experience to have sustained therapeutic benefit. And some of the work, Roland Griffith and Bill Richards' work at Hopkins, would suggest that the strength of the mystical experiences is associated with the amplitude and the durability of the therapeutic effect. But your notion of neuroplasticity and that cortical plasticity seems to challenge that. And I wonder, is this why microdosing helps some people? And is there a threshold in which of ego dissolution in which the doors of perception open and that therapeutic effect occurs, or is there a more dose-related therapeutic impact that the neuroplasticity would explain?
Yeah, I mean, it's another one of those key questions that are difficult to answer, so I can only sort of take a stab at it. And I put up this slide because, you know, this nonlinearity, apparent nonlinearity, I mean, it's very small sample size, so a bit early to say, but there are other bits of evidence that we have that suggest that nonlinearities in the serotonin 2A receptor system. I could say that, you know, that relationship between the mystical type experience and the therapeutic outcomes is pretty reliable. I mean, it's one of the most reliable findings in psychedelic science, I would say. Quite how you characterize the experience is an open question. But that's just in terms of language and framework. But what we have is, you know, the experience seems to be critically important. The quality of the experience seems to be critically important to the longer-term outcomes. So microdosing comes along, and all of a sudden you don't have a clear experience, and yet people are reporting these improvements in well-being. So what's going on there? I just think it's a subtle, you know, version, in a sense, of the same thing. Sure, it's not being mediated by a massive transformative experience and the epistemic transformation that comes with that, that now you see things and you know something about yourself, about the world, that's radically different to where you were beforehand. With microdosing, maybe it's just a subtle sort of lubrication of the mind that is, again, I think if, I actually think context, set and setting might be being overlooked a bit with microdosing and might still be actually a very important component, because this meme exists around microdosing that it's effective. And where's the science? There's not much that's published on microdosing, but there's a lot of positive projection towards microdosing that it works. So you come into this plasticity with this assumption that this is going to be really good for you. And I just think that that could be a really important component. We know psychedelics promote suggestibility, so I do think that that's likely part of the picture. So I just think it's probably, you know, with those lower doses, it's not happening through a big experience, but it's still of the same ilk, just much, you know, attenuated. Yeah.
Robin, I'm so grateful for your time and also grateful to this group for putting on the event and making this space for us. I'm filled with questions, but I'll try to limit myself to one or two. So I was struck by one of the slides which presented a model of what happens in psychedelics as a decrease in the importance of our mental models, allowing for a more free flow, bottoms up of information. And two questions come up from this model. One is, this strikes me as similar to what some Buddhist meditation teachers describe in terms of getting beyond our mental models and observing through pure awareness, observing what's happening directly, as opposed to you know, operating from mental models like a sense of self or other mental models. And so I'm curious if you have any comment on similarities there. And part B of my question, or my second question, is this model also seems in contrast to other models I have of psychedelics related to, say, magical thinking, which you've written about, or an activation of imagination, even delusion. Like, this seems like by this model, it seems like we're observing reality more directly with fewer impediments. But in another model in my head, during a trip, you're in an imaginary space filled with dragons and mystical things and wonderful experiences, which doesn't seem like observing reality in a direct way. So any comment on that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. We've got some, again, one of these examples where we've got some juicy data and findings back in the lab that isn't sort of public knowledge yet. And one of them relates to shifts in metaphysical beliefs through psychedelic use, and specifically with DMT, actually. And Chris Timmerman, who's leading our DMT research, is really excited to think about this in relation to the predictive processing model and the Rebus model, where, if we take the internal predictive models are relaxed and evidence is having more kind of purchase, it's getting up more freely and it's impinging on awareness more easily, then what does that evidence come from the outside world, or does it come from the internal world? And then, you know, if one takes DMT and experiences seemingly sentient beings, that's data, in a sense, coming up and impinging on awareness, and it's going to force, it's going to knock on the door to say, shift your assumptions, shift your beliefs, because these things are real. They're really real, you know, and you do, that can happen after one experience or multiple experiences. All of a sudden, the evidence, so to speak, is calling up a revision of one's metaphysical assumptions. It feels like one's being leaves this world and goes to this other world that feels just as real, just as compelling, yet is other. And so that's what the evidence is saying. It's saying, change your models, shift your beliefs, shift your assumptions. And people do, but are they right to? Is it always signal, and is it always the signal that we think it is? Because a lot of people have those experiences and they think, this is the biggest scientific discovery of all time. There is literally another dimension, the DMT dimension, and the DMT molecule is a gateway to it. Or you could say, this is information held within our minds and brains, and it is called up when we relax our normal belief structures that impose on our sensory experience, so that, let's say, for example, encountering a sentient being, a entity under DMT, might be evidence for archetypes within our minds that must have some association to brain function. That these, as Jung would say, are averaged images of human evolution, if you want, that we have encountered things that would, on average, fall within the archetype of the monster or the benevolent being, the angel, and so that's what's happening. So you could either say this is evidence of an alternative dimension, or you could say this is evidence of the nature of the mind and the brain, and either of those possibilities are things that should leave us with a sense of wonder and awe, really. And my view is that they're of the mind and the brain, and that's what the evidence that comes up in those exceptional conditions is. Yeah, that's my view.
Hi, my name's Mike. I'm a psychiatrist and therapist in the MDMA assisted psychotherapy trial run by MAPS. I wanted to start off by thanking you for doing such important work, and specifically for this upcoming trial of comparing psilocybin to escitalopram for patients with depression. It's a long overdue study, and I'm sure we're all very excited to hear the results. I'm wondering if there's anything more that you can say at this point before it's been published about some of the experimental design, specifically what role, if any, psychotherapy plays with it, and also if you can give us a sense of what the preliminary results are?
Sure. Sorry, it was a bit of a cruel teaser, wasn't it, really? Yeah, I know. Yeah, I mean, the model we follow is the psychotherapeutic model. A colleague of mine, Rosalind Watts, is leading the therapy team and has become increasingly inspired by acceptance and commitment therapy and how that can, as other teams are and are publishing on this, which is great, and how that resonates and fits seemingly quite harmoniously with the psychedelic model, so that has a degree of structure, and I've tried to encourage Ros to sort of get it down. She has recently published on it this ACE model: accept, connect, embody. So you can find that. But I think, increasingly the world is going to need some kind of structured, manualized approach, whether it be, followed to religiously or just used as a kind of guidelines, is an open question. Maybe the latter is better. And then, the other components of things, what we've done is just to look at the primary outcome measure, which is the QIDS, self-rated, 16-item, quick inventory of depressive symptoms, and also response rates, remission rates. And we looked at 3 components where there was a strong hypothesis that we would actually see superiority with psilocybin versus escitalopram. We looked at sexual dysfunction, we looked at emotional blunting, and we looked at insight. And I so want to tell you, yeah. Well, you know, there is this long-held assumption that has been difficult to test, that SSRIs blunt emotional responsiveness, and maybe psychedelics push it the other way. So we have some preliminary support for that, which is really exciting. And the response rates, yeah. Do you know, they're good with escitalopram, which is good because it suggests that, you know, we're not corrupting the design, and the blind seems to work quite well. But they're really good with psilocybin. So let's just leave it there, I think.
Hi. So I have a question, 2 things. Have you ever encountered anybody that didn't have any response whatsoever to psilocybin?
Yes.
Do you know what that's related to?
And I think it's fair to say we don't know yet whether it's, could it be psychological alone? Is that possible? You know, what's the relationship between the neurobiology there, genetic thing, and metabolic thing? Is it possible to psychologically resist a drug effect? I think the honest answer is we just don't know.
And the other question is, I was sort of looking at who in the United States is doing brain scans and work in the Amen Institute, I think, in New York and so forth. And I was wondering, you know, with some of their studies, they're looking at a child, for example, that falls at a young age can have a part of the brain that's damaged. When you're doing these scannings, do you see a vast variety in the brain scans of individuals anyway? And if somebody has either beginning of Alzheimer's or some kind of brain injury, do you see a difference in that functioning of the brain after the use of psilocybin?
I don't know of anything that I could say concretely that could answer that. To be honest, I don't think we have enough data, and we had a patient with particularly large ventricles, and then you know, David Nutt saw this anatomical scan and said, "Oh, were they a drinker? Do they have a history of?" And that's come up before, that people see a brain like that and they think, "Oh, this is early stage dementia," and it turns out that they haven't been declaring how much they're drinking. I mean, we do our breathalyzer tests and quite thorough screening, so we'd like to think that we would have found that out. But I mean, they can be pretty clever, as you'll know, in terms of hiding things. So I don't know, and I mean, that was one case, and I don't think their response was particularly atypical. I just don't think we know enough yet. You would assume that there's a relationship, and I think the PET team in Copenhagen, Gita Knudsen's team, have data on the density of serotonin to a receptor expression imaged with PET imaging and sensitivity to psychedelics. I think there's something being worked up around that. I think they found a relationship, but it's just too early days in terms of predictors of response. The best predictors that we're seeing appear to be psychometrics, actually. And if there's anything, I mean, what you really want is something way ahead of time to be a predictor, because if you see set and setting predicting, that's a little bit too close to the event to do anything about. So if you can find some trait predictors, that would be really valuable. And we have absorption. Trait absorption seems to be quite a reliable predictor of sensitivity. And there is a relationship between trait absorption and the serotonin 2A receptor system as well. So a few clues there.
Robin, can you tell us what trait absorption is?
Absorption, a synonym might be immersion, how easy it is for you to be immersed in experiences. They might be art, movies, you know, music. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. I had a question about communication and synchrony. So you have remember the image you have where the networks are communicating with each other really well, and placebo, and in psychedelics there's a lot more what you call communication. But you know, synchrony is also a characteristic of seizure activity. And so how do you know sometimes whether it's increased synchrony of activity is actually some meaningful communication or exchange of information versus a disruption of communication to such an extent?
Yeah.
And this philosophically goes to the, you know, the Stangroff idea, the Huxley idea of the brain as a receiver potentially that's filtering things. And if you're actually preventing typical brain communication, may the brain then receive things that are, quote, beyond the brain. So I want to link those two things together.
Yeah. I do have quite a bit of time for that reducing valve analogy, and it fits quite well, I think, with the rebus idea. But I just think there's an error that people make with it. They think if you reduce if you broaden the reducing valve, you're going to get more sensitivity to the world. But what about the inner world? What about, you know, the breadth and depth of the mind and the brain? You open that valve and you see more of the mind and the brain, the mind revealing itself to itself. And I think that's what psychedelics are and what they do. I just think it's a bit of a kind of attribution error to say it's coming from beyond the brain, you know, some kind of, I don't know, magical transmission of some sort, you know. What was the first component?
The potential difference between synchrony and communication of information.
Yeah.
And that when you see a lot of synchrony, it could, you know, seizures, for example, involve great synchrony across cortical areas, but you wouldn't necessarily say there's meaningful communication of information going on. Is there a potential to confuse that in some of these things?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Maybe it's grades, you know. With a seizure, you just have this global locking, phase locking of the activity, and it's just so dramatic. Whereas with psychedelics, you get this incredible enrichment of the ongoing activity. It's very complex, and that just might relate to the breaking down of conventional networks in the brain. There's a collaboration with Selen Atasoy at the University of Oxford, who's looked at these harmonic patterns in the brain, spatiotemporal patterns. And there she found that the higher spatial frequency patterns have more expression under psychedelics. And so it's like the brain is becoming more kind of bitty. And if you were to look at seizures, you would expect a more kind of binarized, sort of black and white, the whole brain sort of on and off, on. Yeah, it's a different pattern, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi. Do you mind going back to that slide with the things on the left that can help with the emotional breakthrough? I forget what you were calling them.
Yeah.
Yeah, the contextual factors. Is there any, do we have any clue whether understanding everything that you've been talking about today, like having a mental model of how these medicines and compounds can work, either can help or hurt your ability to get to emotional breakthrough? I don't know if that question makes any sense, but
yeah, it does. So what's missing from this model are those that predict worse scores on emotional breakthrough, or another components of the experience, like what about higher scores on challenging experience? I could say something about worse scores on emotional breakthrough, and actually these things tend to relate anyway. Distraction happening in the environment. We've got a few different types of these psychedelic surveys. This one's for ceremonies. And so we get, there's quite a few mushroom ceremonies, like the ones in Amsterdam with the truffles, and ayahuasca ceremonies as well. And probably particularly with the ayahuasca ceremonies, you have the potential for distraction with people purging and such like. And so that was a negative predictor of emotional breakthrough, in the sense that if there was a lot of distraction in the environment, there were worse scores on emotional breakthrough. And the other one was distrust. So I know that's just the inverse of maybe emotional support and rapport, but any sense of distrust with the people in your environment was associated with worse scores there. We had assumptions around things like stubbornness maybe being a predictor, but didn't see anything that was especially significant there, I think, at this stage. Thank you.
Really great.
Good.
Anything else? I feel like we could talk all day, but we have a few more minutes, so we've...
This is maybe not so much about the science as much as it is the social aspect of psychedelic research. As I do like a lot of literature reviews and kind of see the people spearheading the idea of psychedelic research, it seems to be majority white people that are involved in psychedelic research. And you had just got done talking about ayahuasqueros and curanderos and like people who have been doing this kind of research, let's say, in cultural aspects for thousands of years. What do you see being like for a young researcher who is a Latino male going forward, how do I include those people with diversity and inclusion in a space that is predominantly being like rediscovered by majority white people?
Yeah, well, a great question. It's an interesting interaction because in a sense you don't want to come in and spoil, what has a long heritage and has developed a particular way. If you come in and say, now with my Western scientific analytical model, you really should be collecting data, and I could really show you how you should be doing this better, it's and all the tourism, how problems are arising through that. So it's a difficult one because, I guess Western people are having now this privileged access to this culture and these experiences, and are being blown away by it. And how does this all roll out with that culture being protected? And yeah, but then inclusion might be a negative thing in a way, So it's a complex one. I don't have the answer. Although we had a half Gabonese girl come and visit us in our last team meeting, who'd discovered, she wasn't aware, but she'd discovered that her family have a heritage of iboga use. And so she went over there and had an experience. And so we were all, just deeply, fascinated to hear about this experience in the culture. And then she was like, and I just want to tell everyone, and I want to do something, and I want to organize things so more people can have these experiences. And don't they realize in Gabon that has all these problems and drinking, what great culture they have there. And there was this sort of mixed feelings there in the group where it was like, it just requires a lot of thought and care, and maybe don't charge into something like that because there's something to be said about protecting it.
So more specifically, like when I look at the research methods of like the recruitment of individuals, I see upwards of like 70, 80, maybe even sometimes 90% of the demographics of people that are being tested in these research settings are predominantly non-POC.
Yeah.
So, like, is there a push in the research setting to include more people with more diversity? And because that way it makes the research more generalizable.
Yeah.
As of right now, I don't necessarily feel like it is.
Yeah, no, quite. There is, but it's tricky. You know, how do we do that and do it in a way that's, you know, respectful and not kind of just sort of, I don't know, characterizing people in a particular way. I mean, we could look at the work of geography makes a difference. I think Peter Hendrick's work it has a much more representation of African Americans in that sample because of where he's based in Alabama. For whatever reason, we have, you know, predominantly white people knocking on our doors, and mostly men, disproportionately men, when depression is at least equally distributed, if not more so, more prevalent in females. So something's going on in terms of a selection bias. It's quite difficult to override, and I'm very open to a solution to this problem, and certainly recognize that there is a problem there.
There was a gentleman asked earlier about Buddhism and what you thought about the comparison or analogy to Buddhist meditation and some of this.
Oh, well, it's such a good fit, you know. Buddhist psychology, Buddhist practice, Buddhist philosophy. There's so many points of resonance with the lessons that people seem to get via psychedelics and wisdom that isn't, I mean, in certain cultural situations, maybe it is there. There's a heritage of kind of wisdom teachings, but not necessarily, and maybe not for us sort of Westerners coming into that space. And so, you know, as others have said, psychedelics are just this tool, they're a vehicle. They don't impart wisdom in and of themselves. They might show you things, but they can quickly be forgotten, and lifestyle changes might not happen, even though you sense how everything is interconnected on this profound level. You still don't change. You don't necessarily, you know, then go and change your diet and your behavior and such like. So I think that translation of the insight into behavioral change is so critically important and speaks to such a key component of where we are, which is community. And it's an opportunity to say why we have 3 bits in our logo, because one of them is Sangha. I mean, you can play around with logos, but Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha was the motivation for having 3 bits in our logo. And I just think, you know, if having that kind of almost safety net and way of cultivating positive change through community is essentially important going forward.
See, we're having a hard time stopping you.
Okay, no, I'm happy to stop.
We're stopping the questions,
Sure.
but I think we have to. We have 20 more minutes, so we can hang around. But I think we should be done.
Yeah,
with
sure.
it.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. We'll send you out details as we know more. We know that Harriet Witt is coming from the University of Chicago to talk to us about her work with microdosing. And we might have space for another speaker, so if anyone has someone they're really dying to hear and have access to, certainly let us know. Anything else?
There's still food out there. They've saved that so people can mingle out there and they can take a while after lunch.
Great. So there's still food for those of us who didn't get much to start with. Let's go eat. And we can keep mingling. I don't think they'll kick us out after 3. We'll get you out of this room.
Oh, thanks.
1 minute, Eric, come on out. Not have any effects. Can everyone sit down and just be quiet for a minute so we can hear Mary?
Because I would like some, I have a question for everyone here. If anyone
Wait, Mary,
exactly
can I?
had experience with. But as far as your question, we have seen a few. I can probably pick out 5 over the years that didn't. But most recent, we're doing an anorexia study, and we've only run 3 sessions, but they have had, and they're 20 and 25 milligrams, and the effect is almost not very much at all. So I'm just wondering if anyone has any experience. You can talk to me later or now, anecdotally or any. We've heard from a different groups of people now that this group needs higher doses. And when I say 20 and 25, that's not weight-based for this study because they come in at such a low weight, they would have gotten like maybe 10 milligrams if it was by weight. So, we don't know what's going on. We don't know if it's the physiological because of their diets over the years or if it's the blockage because of control. So anyway, if anyone has any, can offer any help with that, I'd really like you to come talk with me. Yeah. In the legal world. Definitely not the other world.